Commander of the DoD Cyber Defense Command, formerly Joint Force Headquarters, Doden, Director of Defense Information Systems Agency, former Commanding General of the Army Cyber Center of Excellence in Fort Eisenhower, and inaugural editorial board member of our peer-reviewed journal. Our moderator will be our MCPA National President, Mr. Chris Cleary.
There it goes. Sir, first of all, thank you a million times. Thank you for coming. For a lot of the key speakers, because of what happened over the weekend, I'm like, everybody's going to get returned to station. Nobody's going to come anywhere. There's going to be nobody in the audience.
We just started early this morning, that's all.
Yeah. So again, a million thank yous for being here. I think one of the things that I wanted to point out to everybody in the room was a little bit about General Stanton's background and sort of association with this organization from the very beginning. Major, Lieutenant Colonel, probably back in the day, helping Joe do some of the reviewing of the journals and some of the writers. So, you know, this is one of the few rare moments we actually get to see somebody in the organization have elevated to such a level to be, you know, and again, to be associated with this. It's heartwarming, it's amazing.
Well, I'm super proud and honored to be here. It's an ounce humbling looking at the crowd. But yes, Joe and I were in the basement of the Nolan building on Fort Belvoir when his idea started to blossom. And I said, hey, you know what? We're absolutely a profession. We have technical competency, deep technical competency, but we apply it with values. And while the definition of a profession is slightly more complicated, that's at its core, right? You got your technical capabilities, and then you apply and allocate and execute them through values. And who couldn't be part of that? You know, what a fantastic opportunity. Congratulations on where we are. Congratulations, as we were walking in, Joe and I were talking about the demographic of the audience. Junior enlisted soldiers, senior officers, civilians, professionals, folks that are dedicated to a common mission. So I couldn't be more honored to be here. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, no, thank you. And then I just want to follow up with, you know, again, going back to that couple degrees of separation, you know, not even knowing it, there were several times, even our own careers, JFC-CNW, you were at JFC-GNO when Buckshot Yankee was going down, and the social network warning order. I don't know if anybody remembers that one. That was a lot of late nights writing a warning order because people were violating Facebook things. But then, you know, the work that you were doing out in Mustatatuk when you were the OT stuff, showing the defensive OT infrastructure, your deputy commander at J3, the deputy J3 at US Cybercom, and now this. Can you just give people who maybe are not familiar with the career? Because I like to think that you're one of the first true, no kidding, cyber professionals that started that kind of went through the gambit to get where you are now. Could you talk about that for a little bit? Because I think that's important for people to hear.
Sure. First off, I joined late because Mo O'Connor wouldn't hire me soon enough. Good to see you, Mo. I transitioned into the cyber world about halfway through my career. So I started my career as an infantry officer, graduate from West Point. I had the privilege of leading soldiers in combat during the initial invasion of Iraq, which was a foundational and transformational experience. Helped shape how I think like a maneuverist, think like gaining and maintaining contact with the enemy. Then the Department of Defense and our United States government invested significantly in my education. Thank you, taxpayers. And I had the opportunity to get advanced degrees in computer science. And then I was teasing Colonel Retired Maureen O'Connor, but in reality, she's to blame for this because I cold called her one day while I was completing my dissertation at Johns Hopkins. Go Jays. And I said, hey, I need a job, a needs of the Army assignment when I finish up at Johns Hopkins. I don't really want to move. You're now working at Army Cyber Command that just stood up. Do you have a job? And she said, well, I don't know who you are. Why don't we meet at Starbucks? This is a true story. So if you know Mo, 4.5 hours later, I had a job offer to report in to the actually NSA Cyber Command headquarters as a liaison officer as part of Army Cyber Command. So I was about 8 months to a year late from the advent of Army Cyber. But I've been on the team ever since. I had an awesome opportunity to transition into the operational forces at the early stages. I had the privilege and honor of commanding the Army's Cyber Protection Brigade in the early stages, helping think through how we were going to employ cyber protection teams, helping think through what does a readiness model for those teams look like, what does employment look like, what does it mean to have an intermediate level of command and control in the form of a battalion and later a task force in order to execute effectively in the domain. And then in the course of supporting Army Cyber Command, General Nakasone was the commander at the time. We all know his path and what his future held. He recruited me, perhaps, up to be the Deputy J3 at Cyber Command, where I had, again, the opportunity to work on some of these really hard problems of what does it mean to organize as small units of action? What does it mean to develop readiness associated with that? And then, eventually, they hired me to be the Department of Defense SIGO. There's some irony here. I was not ever a signal officer. I was an infantry officer, and then I became a cyber officer. Anecdotally, if you ever served in a tactical level operations center for a Army maneuver force, there's a lot of love for the signal officer, affectionately referred to as the SIGO. And it doesn't matter whose fault it is or what the problem is. It doesn't matter that you're being masked by terrain, that the enemy's jamming you. If you can't communicate, it is the SIGO's fault. And you break a number of hand mics over the K-pot of the SIGO to get the network working. Well, eventually the Army will PCS you to the other side of your problem. Here I am. I am the Department of Defense SIGO. I get calls routinely from senior officials to make sure that they can communicate. So sorry for the diatribe there, but a bit of the history.
No, but I think the history is important because, like I was saying, you could say we're really not that old as a community. If we, what I was saying before, if you snap the chalk line, 2010 might be the beginning of this. We're only really 15 years into this. Yeah. To include a new elevated command under your command, which is, again, another signal that some of these organizations are getting the attention they deserve to be elevated. Maybe you talk a little bit about the new organization.
Hey, a lot of pride in our lineage, in our heritage as the Joint Force Headquarters Department of Defense Information Network. It takes like a minute to even say it. Compare that with the Department of Defense Cyber Defense Command. Like, that just sounds cool, doesn't it? Like, I want to pick up this hammer and put it in the chest of the enemy.
That's what
it like, gets you fired up. Like, we're the Cyber Defense Command. And so being sub-unified is significant. Did the resources come raining out of the sky? No, they didn't. However, there's a culture shift. There's a mindset shift. Gain and maintain contact with the enemy and impose cost. Don't randomly chase incidents. Don't chase events. Think in context. Think about what the enemy is attempting to accomplish. Think about what missions are relevant to us. Think about where our missions and the enemy's intent and capabilities overlap, the center of that Venn diagram. Build your engagement area, and then, I can't swear, beat the enemy.
You probably can.
And beat the enemy, right? And so being the Cyber Defense Command, again, didn't translate into a whole bunch of resources. We're optimistic in the future that we'll be able to extend some enabling and supporting functions that we think are necessary in the command. But the mindset and the culture is to impose cost on the enemy.
Yeah, can I pull at that just a little bit, because I think that's one of the important things. You know, having seen the game from a slightly different level, you know, working at the Department of the Navy and POM level, and you know, all the big problems the Navy's working through. You know, it all came down to dollars and resources and prioritization of mission and what was the most important to, you know, one to N. You know, what became obvious is in the Department of Defense, people love buying weapon systems, right? I think the Air Force cracked that nut 15 years ago when they started labeling things that they did as, you know, the CVA Hunt weapon system, right? You put a moniker to it, it becomes more important. It's not just an information technology system. Some of the testimony that you gave to Congress was pretty adamant about, you know, the environment that you oversee is a weapon system. It underpins everything that we do. Could you kind of pull at that a little bit? Because I think that's the thing that drives future prioritizations, resourcing, and growth of the organization.
Sure. Just do a quietly, independently, do a quick 5-second thought experiment about what aspect of warfighting doesn't require data. All right, 5 seconds is up. Getting the right data to the right place at the right time to make a better and faster decision than the enemy is central to how we fight. Really, what's changed over the past 10 to 20 years is the proliferation of the data, and we have to use it effectively. Our means of moving, analyzing, sense-making of data has to be looked at in the context of warfighting. Our senior leaders, our leaders at echelon, not inside of our warfighting domain, but all leaders, have to think about what data they need in order to support their decisions in ways that they haven't historically. They cannot ignore the domain. I make an analogy when I speak to Army formations, to armor, tanks, and warfighting with tanks. You don't plan an armor mission without thinking about where your refuel point is. You simply don't. Because a tank without fuel is useless. And so before you cross the line of departure, you think about where that refuel on the move site is going to be and when you're going to get your next splash of gas so that you can continue on the fight. It is critically important in today's day and age that we think about what data do I need at what point in the war fight, at what point in the battle, and then making sure it's available when it's needed. You heard Admiral Velez talk about how we tied CyberGuard to PAC Sentry. I'll tell you what, if you don't take your data with you into the first island chain, how thick are the pipes that are going to be available to you once a kinetic fight starts? You have to think about that. What data do you need? If you are a maneuver warfighting formation, you're going to cross the line of departure, you've got all of these systems that are heavily dependent on data. You're going to cross the line of departure with a set of data. Once you move, if you continue to transmit that data, who's watching you? Electronic warfare capabilities that the enemy has. If you're continuously pushing data, you're not going to survive long. How does that change the calculus? How does that change how you think as a warfighting maneuver commander to say, this is the data that I need, I better have it. But then, when am I getting my next splash of gas? When am I going to purposefully design my plan so that I can get a data download of what has changed and what I need, intermediate step in the execution of my fight? Those are warfighting capabilities. The network that supports moving that data is a weapon system. Our internet access points that provide our defenses is a weapons system. Thunderdome, there's another cool term. This is implementation of a zero trust architecture. It's a combination of weapon systems. And I'll tell you what, we better think of it like that. Because if we're not trained and ready to use it, it's not effective. Anybody ever actually try to configure a zero trust environment? It's complex. If you don't understand the tools that are inherent to it, then you're not going to configure it right. If you don't configure it right, then you've wrapped yourself in a false blanket of confidence that you've got security when in fact You've got gaping holes in your plan. So we better think about that weapon system in the context of our personnel, our equipment's readiness, and our training. PSRT readiness model. Sound familiar to those military professionals that are in the room? For good reason. We better train on our weapon system so that we can use it effectively at time of need. Sorry, I'm giving really long-winded answers.
No, this is great because this is going to be a conversation because it just leads me to the next idea. So in the Navy, if you go back to the early 1900s when the Navy was having its own class of cultures within the communities, the surface warfare community, in the beginning had very specific engineering tracks and very specific deck officer tracks. And then in the early 1900s, they made a decision like you really can't operate a ship unless you know how it works. And those communities started to come together, and now all modern surface warfare officers, some go down engineering paths, but it's certainly part of the curriculum to understand how the ship works and how the ship moves through the water.
Right.
So the question is, now that we're at this new period of time where there's war fighters and then there's the cyber guys over here, from a culture standpoint, is it an education component, or do you see in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years, there are parts of these communities that begin to come together? Because to your point, you can't do anything without data or technology. Does those other tankers, pilots, submariners really have to be brought into a part of this community to enable their mission sets?
Yeah, they have to. It's a warfighting domain. Does anybody get a pass on understanding how to pull the components of the warfighting domains together if you are a maneuver commander? If you're an infantry officer and you don't know how to use artillery, you're not a very good infantry officer. If you don't understand the cyber warfighting domain, arguably, you're not good at your responsibilities, regardless if those are flying planes, moving ships, maneuvering submarines, or operating in the Army. But yes, we, inherent to everybody in this room, has some degree of responsibility of explaining our domain to the warfighting community. We have to think about how to explain it in ways that will resonate with everybody else. If you jump in right away and start talking about sequence selection and iteration in your coding, and you start talking about geospatial multidimensional data sets and the storage hierarchy necessary, you've lost them. But you have to be able to talk to them in a way that will resonate with them. Like, hey, if you don't get gas, you don't move. If you don't have data, then you can't call for fire. Relatively simple terms, but terms that will resonate and ensure that it becomes part of the training and educational model for the rest of our warfighting community. I can speak closely to what the Army's doing, having just been come from the Cyber Center of Excellence.
Please,
and
yeah.
the institutional
Because
Army.
the other services can learn from that, right, at the end of the day, yeah.
So we very carefully and purposefully partnered with the Maneuver Center of Excellence out of Fort Benning, Georgia, and took EW capabilities out to their training environment and jammed them. And all of a sudden, these infantry warfighters that are going through their training can't communicate. And then we brought in UAS and dropped simulated grenades on top of them. And when the simulated grenade drops on top of you in infantry training, you pick up your stuff and you move. If you keep picking up your stuff and you're moving, then you don't sleep and you don't eat. You don't sleep and you don't eat, you start to learn real fast. I got to change something that I'm doing, because if this UAV keeps following me, then I'm not going to be able to eat or sleep. So something as simple as introducing a 3-man element of EW soldiers into the training at the infantry school changes that leader model, and then you start to grow it.
Do you think that the doctrine behind all this, as we're writing it, so I'm a big fan of a lot of things the Air Force has done over time, and Boyd and OODA loop, and one of the things Boyd was most noted for was a thing called the energy maneuver theory. He could break it down to a formula, and he said if you understood the state of your aircraft, which is a definition of thrust minus drag over total weight times velocity, and the state of another aircraft, that's how you're going to beat him in a maneuver fight. Energy, I can use my energy better than an adversary. And just taking that formula and messing with it, I was like, well, is it possible to understand the state of your network? As simple as, let's say it was, known vulnerability minus available patches over total systems times the speed to remediate. Yeah. And then you as the commander say, I could understand the state of my network as this, and I can modify it or change it or maneuver it in such a way that I can, keep the adversary off pace. Is part of that kind of the doctrine of how we're going to maneuver warfare in cyberspace? Things that DISA is helping to, continue to drive?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting thought. I hadn't put it into air combat terms, but step number one in defining your state is being able to see yourself. And we historically have not been really good at that. But I'll submit that attempting to see yourself down to 3 million endpoints simultaneously is an intractable problem. While there's continuous modernization and change that's happening across that total landscape. So change the model, change the doctrine, change the thought. Apply warfighting principles that all resonate with us. What's my mission? Mission, enemy, troops, terrain, time. What is important to me? What's important to the enemy? What's the enemy's intent? What capabilities does the enemy have? Will those capabilities have an impact on my ability to execute the mission? And if you haven't walked through that analysis, then you're not focused on the prioritized resources necessary to see and defend effectively. And so it's not new doctrine. It's our doctrine of how we think about the joint warfight and applying it into the cyberspace warfighting domain so that we defend what matters. Attempting to defend everything effectively defends nothing because you spread yourself too thinly. That doesn't mean ignore it. We have boundary defenses because we need boundary defenses. I'm a zero trust zealot. However, we still need a boundary defense because the enemy is still attacking us thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of times a day, and I got to be able to clear that noise out of the fight. Still need that boundary, not ignoring it. However, as we apply our zero trust implementation, apply it in a way aligned with our warfighting principles. Think about what the mission is, think about what the enemy might try to do, and adjust the defense accordingly. That's doctrine.
Yeah, can I pick up on the attack piece? Because this is one of my favorite words that I think we overuse in this community. TJ is going to laugh when I say this, but in the Navy, there's a thing called a vampire call, right? If you're in a certain conditions and you have electronic warfare gear that have an indication of an inbound, let's say anti-ship missile, vampire, things start to happen very, very quickly because that is the definition of being attacked. But if that same electronic warfare gear picked up a Fruno radar with a mission, with a fission ship, well, I might not want to know, I might be detected, but it didn't cross the threshold of being attacked. So as we're trying to be more definitional, the word, you know what I'm trying to say, with that, because what I love about where you're going with this is certain things would happen that would trip rules of engagement or response options or whatever, and every port scan on a computer is not an attack. Yep. But there are certain, absolutely, Stuxnet, you could argue over things like SolarWinds. Was SolarWinds an attack or just a really good way to get access to information? But Saudi Aramco, Stuxnet certainly was designed to degrade, deny, destroy, disrupt, blah, 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 blah. And when we identify those things, it would trip you into certain actions, but do we have to be more disciplined with our language?
So I'm gonna steer away from the language for a second and just stay on the thought process. Yeah. Because ultimately, we got to get the thought process right, and then you write it down into the language, and then it becomes a doctrinal publication that we will bring into our schoolhouse to coach, teach, mentor, and bring folks along. Being the DoD Cyber Defense Command and being subunified, drives us towards campaigning. We need to operate at the operational level of war as a headquarters. Stop chasing incidents. It is not bearing fruit. Think about it in the context of a campaign. The enemy is not arbitrarily attacking. Are they being opportunistic because they had an awesome exploit that found its way into a critical system, and then they're going to build on that? You know, technology and vulnerabilities therein become a reason for us to campaign. If there is a version of a technological system, I'll just say a router, that has a vulnerability, where across the DoDN do we have those routers? It shouldn't be arbitrary, and I shouldn't have Army Cyber addressing one, MARFOR Cyber addressing another, and AF Cyber addressing a third, and the three of them not talking to each other. The execution against the enemy that's attacking that vulnerability needs to be coordinated. So we need to campaign when we have a technological weakness in the DoDN. We also need to campaign when we see a threat actor that is driving towards an intent of our enemy. Are they interested in our ability to make decisions? Arguably, yes. But can we leverage intelligence and be more focused? We certainly can. And then once we understand that, can we build our defense so that we can gain and maintain contact with the enemy in that context? Yes. So we need to campaign against vulnerabilities in our technology. We need to campaign against the enemy. But we also need to campaign in order to preserve our maneuverability for our key missions. And our approach to doing that is looking at our commands, what they need to be able to accomplish. It's not a single system that's involved. It's a number of different systems. We developed the concept of a mission thread. How do those different systems exchange data between them in order to do something that's functionally relevant in support of the warfighting community? Well, now that I know those different systems and how they're tied together, I can start looking at what do I need to know about them to ensure that they're operationally effective at my time of need. How might the enemy attack that individual system? Well, what are the indicators and warnings associated with that? And tie that to the next system, and tie that to the next system, and then build the defense around our ability to see that in its totality. It's a different mindset. It's not chasing an individual vulnerability. It's campaigning in order to ensure that we make better and faster decisions than the enemy. Yeah, and then we need to write it down.
That's right, and it's great. And we're not talking about cloud. We're not talking about AI. We're talking about the fundamental principles of how we all operate. So I'm going to ask these. I'm going to combine a couple questions near the end, and then we'll give about 5 minutes for the audience to ask some questions. So I know one of the other key concerns of your organizations is readiness. And then, of course, expanding the scope of the mission, particularly, like one of my things that I focus on a lot of the Navy was critical infrastructure. Really, there's an acknowledgement that a lot of that infrastructure doesn't belong to us, but we have dependencies on it. Yeah. But at some instance, we might be asked to move into defend that terrain. We talk about cyber mission critical terrain. We've gone down that drill for a bunch of time. So I guess the combination of readiness with sort of the expanding mission of your organization, and then maybe a little bit of what do you think the community is going to look like in 5 or 10 years? With that as a backdrop.
Yeah, so the first point, I already almost jumped out of my chair with the discussion about readiness, right? If you're not trained on how to execute with the systems that you have, then what are we doing? So we have to understand the warfighting systems that are available to us, and then we have to make sure that individuals know their jobs and that the individuals that have to collaborate with each other collectively understand what their tasks are, and then validate that they can do it. So readiness is critically important as we move forward. It's had
the expanded scope,
Yeah. So when we think about the expanded scope and what it means to operate as the Cyber Defense Command, we need enabling functions and enabling capabilities. You can't defend what you can't see. And so how are we looking at that data in an effective way? What's the skill set required to do the data engineering and write the analytics to see the environment in a meaningful way? How do we, as an operational level of war headquarters, take intelligence and tailor it according to the operating environment? It's one thing to know how a nation-state actor performs, but how will they attack this particular system in context matters. And so having the intelligence and the right people in order to vector that in and drive it is critically important. You heard Admiral Velez say that we stood up this concept of Task Force Port. We thought long and hard about the name. When we were in the process of supporting the exercise, because in the exercise, the enemy was attacking multiple ports simultaneously. Again, don't look at them individually. But what's the intermediate level of headquarters that can command and control multiple different maneuver elements, CSSPs, industry partners, mission elements of cyber protection teams, together, synchronized, coordinated, in support of an operational mission when we know that the enemy is campaigning against us. The way that they're attacking one port probably looks a lot like the way that they're attacking another one. So let's synthesize that under one command and control headquarters so that we're synchronized in our execution.
And again, just a minute on where you think this is all going. Like if you could look into a crystal ball and say, what does 5 years look like? What does 10 years look like?
Yeah, so we have to modernize our architecture. If you play buzzword bingo, and if you've been around me long enough, you know I've got a full card of buzzwords, whether that be cloud, into big data, into zero trust. I keep the list running. But we have to be data centric, but we can't just say that. We have to modernize our architecture to actually be data centric. We have to develop our workforce in ways that can align accordingly. If we don't have people that understand how to aggregate and correlate data, we won't be data centric. So we have to build that skill set into our force. I'll tell you that we have to take advantage of the magnitude of folks with the right skill sets across the entire Department of Defense and not zero in and focus on a handful of folks that are trained to be maneuverists in this environment. We need the entire force engaged. And so over the next 5 years, I think we're going to see a lot of movement in that direction of how do we ensure that our workforce that is currently employed gains the right skills to operate effectively in a data-centric environment, and then how do we tie together the synergy of their work, their effort, so that it feeds into our ability to see it more effectively at a higher headquarters.
Well, that was awesome. I just the plug for MCPA. I think where it started, where it's going. MCPA is here for anything that you need. The joke is it's like the booster club of the cyber organization. We'll bring the orange slices to your events and stuff like that. So we're happy to do that. And again, one team, one fight. And again, everybody's just 1 degree separated from sort of either probably work. Half of the people in this room might work for you right now. For all I know, maybe you should be at work. But so maybe they're
well,
not.
I think there might be a few empty seats based on the people that had to stay at their terminals and in their work center today, unfortunately.
Well, listen, thank you. And I know where'd Joe? Did Joe sneak behind? He didn't. I will sneak behind. Oops, sorry. Work with tools. General, we'd like to thank you and recognize you, and the Colonel's going to go get it, for everything that you have done in the organization and continue to do. The awesome career coming from sort of the beginning of all this. We would also like to recognize you with the Order of Thor.
That's awesome. Thank you.
So, sir, Again, I can't thank you enough for being a part of this, for basically getting it started, and to be one of the, been there, done that. So thank you for everything.
Hey,
Sincerely.
This will take up a prominent spot in my office. And I started by saying that we are, in fact, a profession, right? We have technical competence, and we align that with our values. I appreciate everybody in the room that's dedicated to that. And I am recruiting. So anybody wants to...
Thank you, sir. Thank you.